interesting endeavor. So, Dr. Stokes-DuPass has a PhD in sociology from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. If that's not impressive enough to you, she also has a Master's of Professional Studies in Multicultural Education, a Master of Arts degree in Sociology, and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Journalism, and a Bachelor of Science degree in Sociology, all from State University of New York College at New Paltz. In looking through her resume, she has served as a registrar, she's been a coordinator for faculty advising, she's been teaching, she's been working with curriculum development and assessment, doing a lot of stuff for us in faculty development and assessment here at Holy Family. She's only been with us since September, and she has really become a very critical part of our team. So let me introduce to you Dr. Nicole Stokes-DuPass, who will talk to us today about the impact of immigration reform in Denmark.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. So thank you. I'm excited, and I hope to get some critical feedback from you guys. This is the book manuscript that I've been working on, feels like forever, but it's out, and come on in, please. We just got started. Come in. Hi. Welcome. Yes, get cookies on the way in. Come in. Welcome. This has been largely my dissertation research and also steps after, for lack of a better word. But the book really focuses in on how citizenship is changing throughout Western Europe. And specifically, I focus on Denmark because when we tend to think of, in the US context anyway, US and Canada, citizenship is often the tie that binds people who are diverse, right? So when we think in the US and we think of all of the, I mean, just look around this room, all the different racial, ethnic, age categories, all the different ways we identify ourselves, citizenship oftentimes is the tie that binds, that we all identify as citizens of the United States oftentimes. And in countries that are experiencing diversity or new to diversity, citizenship is being used in a very different way. It's actually being used in many of these settings as a way of dividing as opposed to uniting, and as a way of preserving a sense of one notion of Danish identity and keeping other groups from being able to make identity claims to Danish identity. So my book looks at the role of states and how states, particularly nation states, are using citizenship in this different way. Again, as I mentioned before, traditionally you would try to incorporate new groups under this national identity and give them access to citizenship as a way of incorporating them. And what we're starting to see in some countries in Western Europe is we're starting to see states use it as a way of keeping groups at a distance. And so this new use is the focus of the book. I also look at Denmark because it's a relative newcomer. It's traditionally been an immigration sending country, so Danish citizens have gone outside of Denmark to other places. It's recently become an immigrant receiving country. And so the response has been from political actors, and particularly the state, has been to restrict access to the country as a response of what they perceive to be diversity that's happening too fast. And it really has been happening in the last 15 years. And I'll give you some numbers for context just so you see how quickly immigrants from different racial, religious, and ethnic backgrounds coming to Denmark, how fast that has occurred. The image that you're looking at is actually Danish journalist Ralph Christensen and his wife Mireille, who's from Turkey. And he put a new face to this issue because he's a Danish citizen. He met Mireille while he was stationed in Turkey for a Danish news organization. He was based in Turkey, and he met his wife there. And he had a desire to bring her back to Denmark so that they could set up a life together. And he encountered many of those obstacles of getting his wife a visa and then going through the process of her seeking citizenship. And he wrote an op-ed piece in Denmark which put a new face on this issue. Many Danish citizens didn't realize that the efforts to restrict access for different groups coming into Denmark, and sort of this push towards a restriction of what they call sham marriages, people who marry other people just to get the citizenship. And so they put a lot of these restrictions in place as a way of preventing those things. But the unintended effect of those laws is that Danish citizens had their own rights restricted. So if I'm a Danish citizen who chooses to couple with somebody who is what they call a third country national, then I may have difficulty bringing my spouse back to my home country. And he was the first to really put a famous face to it, and have people think about it as, wow, I didn't think these things would impact me as a Danish citizen. This is the title of the op-ed piece, and he was being sarcastic, but yes, our pockets. Those are the birds. His op-ed piece called Thanks Immigration Services, and he was being sarcastic to say, thanks a lot for nothing. He described the process of applying for a residence visa for his wife, Meringue, and he described the process as degrading and inhumane. Basically, he, like many of the respondents in my data set, experienced misinformation, the website not matching up to what the person, once you go down to the government agency, is telling you. He also, and I'll talk about some of the requirements for citizenship, but his wife basically felt that she did everything that was required, which was take Danish language courses, which that is a requirement, take a Danish history and culture course. She took all of the examinations and still was denied. And so he described the process. It was a 9-hour process once he got all the paperwork together and they went down. He said we sat in the office for 9.5 hours, only to be shuffled from person to person and getting this information. And so he wrote this piece that basically shined a light on this issue and how it's affecting Danish citizens. So I mentioned some of these in the introduction, but why study citizenship in this context and in this setting? As I mentioned before, Denmark's a newcomer to being an immigrant receiving country. And a lot of the literature, if you've taken any courses on race and ethnicity, a lot of the literature on assimilation and a lot of the literature on immigration has a U.S. narrative. A lot of the theorists study immigration issues and study it either in the U.S., Australia is another location, also the UK and Canada, which have much older immigration histories. And that classic literature on assimilation really sort of looks at those countries and says these are the predictors or the outcomes that we can kind of predict for different categories of people as they assimilate to those cultures. What's really cool, I think, about looking at other settings is when you take those classic theories and start to apply them in different settings, the outcomes change. And so Denmark being a very homogeneous society, just to give you a sense, non-white populations are less than 2% of Danish population. I know. And I lived there for 2 years, so it's another conversation. And also religious diversity is not big there either. Most of their previous people who are emigrating to Denmark were coming from other Christian nations. And so they're starting to receive more people from Buddhism, from largely Islam, so there are a number of religious diversity that's emerging. And these folks, too, are less than 2 to 4% of the population. So very homogeneous. Also, it's timely, right? Another reason, there was an op-ed in the New York Times a couple weeks ago where they said, we have Scandi fever. Sort of this fascination with all things Scandinavian. The girl with the dragon tattoo books. There are certain television shows that are popular, The Killing, which was a big A&E hit that was based off of a Danish television show. IKEA. Need I say more? Swedish company. So the idea of sort of Scandi fever, there's a bit of interest now in what's going on in Scandinavia. And so it also, again, makes the topic very timely. Please, come in. Also, what's happening in the country itself is there have been a lot of debates about this issue of integration rights. Who has rights in this scenario? And of course, within Danes, if you're talking to native Danes, people, again, of traditional Danish origin, they'll say, we have a right to preserve our culture. We have a right to say, if you're coming to Denmark, you have to assimilate and integrate to us. And then, of course, as different groups come in, they're also going to say, well, we have rights to preserve our culture while we assimilate. And so that creates the tension of, well, you have competing interests and you have competing sets of rights and people who have a different perspective on what shape assimilation should take. As I mentioned before, the book is focused on the role of the state, and particularly the Danish state as being a critical actor in this process. The state has really been describing and setting the tone for what is Danish identity, what shape assimilation should look like, what are the cultural requirements for people who seek out Danish citizenship. And again, much of the citizenship literature has moved away from states being important. It's moved towards this sense of boundaries have, fallen away, that we have something called, have you heard this term, post-national citizenship, right? That people are so mobile, right? They're migrating, they may have a foot in both worlds. Even if they migrate to another country, they're still maintaining, using technology, connections to family, friends, or other social networks in their home country. And so a lot of the citizenship discourse has moved toward this notion of nation states are less salient, right? They don't matter as much as they used to because most people keep something called a transnational identity, right? They have a foot in both places. And I'm arguing that no, the state is still relevant, especially in places where the state is shaping the conversation and shaping what this identity should look like and who can have legitimate claims to it. Does that make sense? So that's the argument the book is making. As I mentioned before, Denmark is in the midst of what they call an integration challenge. It's a place where, the state actions matter. And what I mean by that is, this process is unfolding as we're talking about it. And again, to give you context in terms of numbers, in 1984, foreign nationals in Denmark were only 2% of the total Danish population. By the year 2000, this population grew to 4.9%. In 2012, 10.4% of the population. As of January 1, 2014, 14.4% of the population. And now, with two groups in particular, Turkish and the Pakistani populations, they're up to a third generation. So on top of that 14%, their descendants are another 6.5% of the population. So we're talking in 15 years, this population has almost quadrupled. So again, from our perspective in the US, those are not large numbers, not at all. But from their perspective, that growth has happened really in a very short period of time. And so there are a lot of conversations around, what does this mean? Is Denmark becoming a multicultural society? And if yes, what does that look like? And what will it mean for Danish identity? And those are the questions they're grappling with. Some events that have really signaled why there's a contradiction is Denmark also is known as a very progressive nation. They were one of the first to legalize same-sex marriage. Same-sex marriage has been legal in Denmark since 1973. They have gender equality laws, so a husband and a wife who decide they want to take maternity and paternity leave, both sexes get up to 1.5 years of maternity and paternity leave at 80% of their pay. I know. So they had, many of you are going, what? Yes, so when I was working in Denmark, my boss, a male, he had just come back from paternity leave where he was on leave for 1 year. And he and his wife chose to take 1.5 years each. 1 year, he took 1 year, she took 1.5 years, so that their daughter could be 2.5 when she started school. And he did that at 80% of his pay. So there was no financial impact to making those decisions. And they have had those policies in place since the mid-1980s. So in many ways, they are very progressive when it comes to social policy. And so that image is at odds with recent events. And what's been happening recently in Denmark, really since 2004, is we started to see a rise in conservative political parties. So when I lived in Denmark in 2000, Social Democrats, which would be, again, on our continuum of a left-right, viewing politics in that way, Social Democrats were considered moderate liberals. So their policies were things like they would fund very generously the welfare state, the paternity and maternity leave policies that I just mentioned. They would push those initiatives for funding politically. And there was a shift in their election in 2000 where these parties that were more conservative and considered marginal, they gained control of their parliament. And Venstre and Dansk Folkeparti, which is the Danish People's Party, that's what it translates to, those two political parties have very conservative ideology on immigration. And they campaigned on an anti-immigration platform. And they ended up winning the election in 2000 and have maintained control of parliament to this day. So those of you who saw the pictures of the Danish Prime Minister doing the selfie with President Obama a couple weeks ago, right? Inappropriately at the funeral of that woman is from Venstre, which is one of the political parties that I'm going to talk about here. So her doing the selfie, that's the Danish Prime Minister, and she's from Venstre, which is one of these conservative parties. There were two, Venstre and the Dansk Folkeparti, which is the Danish People's Party. Those two parties have maintained political control in Denmark since 2001 and have been responsible for passing a lot of these anti-immigration laws that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. The other event that's happened as well, and many of you probably have heard about the Muslim cartoon controversy. Yeah, some of you are nodding. Those of you who haven't, I'm going to show you some images. Okay. These were the cartoons that were published in the Jyllands-Posten. And the Jyllands-Posten is the major newspaper in Denmark. It's almost like the New York Times. It's equivalent to that. And this, as you can see, the author of the cartoons, or the illustrator rather, and the editorial board of the paper who decided to publish it, they